Few things in this world are more revolting to me than burlap. It's irrational, I know, but there's a reason for it. It was early morning. I was 13, 14 years old. I was out in the barn doing my chores. Grew up on a farm, sheep farm, and I was we had these bags, big burlap bags of cracked corn. We'd feed the sheep, and the bag was empty, so I had to open the next one. I go over, grab the razor, cut it open, but I noticed that the grain in it wasn't settled right, so it needed to be lifted and shifted, or it was all going to spill. So, I'm 13, 14, think I can lift anything, right? So I wrap my hands around the burlap and decide to lift the bag as hard as I can, but when I do, the bag doesn't move at all. My hands just run up along the burlap, and then I look down at my knuckles, and the skin is filleted. Blood's running down my arms. To this day, just the thought, the word burlap, sends shivers up my spine. When we come to Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart. I can feel the shudder in our culture, in this room. It's our burlap. And like my revulsion to burlap, it's not without reason. It might be irrational, but it's not without reason. Like, we've seen the horror. We've seen the pictures of the ancient slave trade. We know about the African slave trade. We've seen the iconic pictures. We've watched the movies. We've heard about the kidnappings from Africa. Some of us, I've been to the actual places that were auction blocks. We've heard the stories of the beatings, the horrors. We know of names like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Beecher Stowe. So maybe the most horrifying thing in the whole bit of this topic of slavery is how many Christians were involved. So I have no desire to whitewash history, to justify slavery, or to somehow see like some silver lining on this evil institution of slavery. And I have no need to defend God or his word. If you find this word from God on slavery to be repulsive, I think you should take it up with God. Here's a prayer from Habakkuk the prophet. He prays like this: "Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing?" That's a biblical prayer. Maybe you need to pray that prayer. That being said, I am concerned. If we all become convinced that God is immoral and the Bible is unjust, I'm not so concerned what's going to happen to God. I am concerned about what's going to happen to us. So, recognizing that we all collectively want to puke when we hear Paul urging slaves to obey their masters, I want to try, and that might be the best we can do, is try. Just try to read this in openness and prayer. Try to read this with Jesus. Try to appreciate why the Apostle Paul, when he writes this to the ancient church at Ephesus, says it this way. Try to see how God's unimaginably great love for us in Ephesians 1, 2, and 3 leads the Apostle Paul to say, no, when slaves, when you look at your life in view of God's love for you, you should obey your masters like that. But here's the question that we're going to bring to the text today, whether we want to or not. Whether the Apostle Paul is answering this or not. This is the question. Why does the Apostle Paul urge slaves to obey their masters? And if we can possibly at least work our way through that to some extent, then maybe we can begin to see what the Apostle Paul and Jesus teach about spiritual slavery and true freedom. But you got to take these two things in order. So our text for today is Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 through 9. It's just 4 verses, but these 4 verses are going to require a lot of context. So let's start with a geography lesson. This is the map of the Mediterranean and what we would call like the ancient Roman Empire, the ancient Roman world. It's circled all the way from Spain, all the way to modern day Israel, all the way down to northern Africa. This encompassed the entire Mediterranean world. And now, when the Apostle Paul is writing this, the Roman world is all under Roman rule, and in that world, slavery is exceedingly common. Exceedingly. So Rome, which would be on the yellow boot-shaped country there, what we would call today Italy, if we ask the question, well, what do you mean by exceedingly common? How many slaves were there really? The dictionary of Paul and his letters, a helpful resource on this, reads, estimates are that 85 to 90% of the inhabitants of Rome and the peninsula Italy were slaves or of slave origins in the 1st and 2nd century AD. Now, let's be clear. At any given moment, there's only like 30 to 35% were actually slaves, but 85 to 90% were of slave origin, meaning that at one point in their life they were slaves who then been set free. So get the language here. In Roman language, you could be a slave, but then you could be redeemed. They would pay a redemption price, and then you are set free. You are no longer a slave. Have you heard that language before? So in ancient Ephesus, we don't have the actual numbers, but ancient Ephesus is like, you can maybe see the little dot there next to Greece. It's in what we would call modern-day Turkey, Asia Minor. In ancient Ephesus, 1,000 miles away from Rome, we don't have the exact demographic numbers, but it's safe to say that slavery was exceedingly common. It was normal, almost boring. At least 25% of the population at any given moment were enslaved. It itself was one of two major slave trade ports, that and Corinth, in the ancient Rome. So like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of slaves were sold or traded in that region. Add to this, last week we talked about the Roman concept of the household. You remember a household was not just like a mom, dad, 2.5 kids, and a little dog named Nero. In the ancient Roman world, a household was that, but it was also everyone who was economically dependent on that system. So it might include slaves and clients and freedmen who worked for that. And we saw last week that a footprint of one was 19,000 square feet, and up to 500 people would live in that. So it's like we think small business here. That's all part of the household. So when we read in Ephesians 5 and 6, the Apostle Paul addressing households in Ephesus, he seamlessly moves from the wife-husband relationship to the child-parent relationship to the slave-master relationship, because all of that was within a household, which is to say, every household, and this is not an overstatement, every Roman household, in that definition, in ancient Ephesus, would have had at that time slaves within it. Christian and non-Christian, didn't matter. The people in ancient Ephesus would not have thought any more about Paul addressing slaves any more than we might think of our modern economic system by which we sell our lives for 40 to 60 hours a week. He wouldn't have thought of that. They're just part of the world. It's the water they swim in. This was pointed out to me really particularly this is maybe a decade ago. Back in Dallas, a friend of mine, Ed and Debbie, they were missionaries in Papua New Guinea. They had helped start a Bible translation center there. If you know anything about Papua New Guinea, it's a wild place in the world. It's where there's still all these indigenous peoples and all these different languages going on there. So they had started this Bible translation center with these, what we would call tribal people, as primitive by any of our standards, as you know. And so after they had finished that, they came back to Dallas to work remotely, but then they invited some of the church leaders, these tribal leaders, to come to Dallas to stay for a summer. So he puts them up in this big high-rise apartment complex overlooking one of these massive Dallas highways, which is 16 lanes wide, all right? And they said after a day or two, they were really curious. They came to Ed and said, "We notice every morning, everyone in the apartment complex comes out like they're in a big rush. They run down to their cars. They all get in their cars, and in a big rush, they all leave. Everyone leaves for the entire day, and they don't come back to the evening. Where do they go? Where do they go?" And he said, "They go to work. They go to work all day long. That's what they do." And they said, "Oh, they're slaves." He said, "No, they're not slaves. They go to work. They choose to work. They choose an employment and a vocation, and then they get paid for it." And so their question, get this question, good question we would not ask. What if they want to go fishing? What if they want to go visit a friend? And he was like, "No, they can't do that. They have to go to work or they'll lose their job. They won't have their pay anymore. They have to go to work." And they said, "So they're slaves." So the Ephesians could not see their slavery any more than we can see ours. Now, with that said, let's actually look at the text and what Paul says to the Ephesian slaves and in whole, and then we'll try and take this piece by piece. He says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ." Your true identity is not a slave of this master, but of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you're not. Because you know the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. Now, if your only context for slavery is American slavery and having watched like Amistad or 7 Years a Slave, this sounds repulsive. It does. I mean, it sounds like Paul's telling them, now be good little slaves and we're going to keep this institution of slavery going. And it's true. The Apostle Paul here is not inciting a rebellion. He's not starting a political revolt. There's nothing in here. He's not suggesting civil war. He's not against the socioeconomic political reality that is the Roman institution of slavery. He's not. In fact, the next passage, the very next passage, what we're going to look at next is going to be, for our battle isn't against that. Our battle is not against flesh and blood. It's against the unseen forces in and under and behind these things. That's what he's concerned about there. So he's going to take that off. The closest thing we'll get to social revolution in the New Testament on this subject is the story of Philemon and Onesimus. Do you know it? So Philemon, he was probably wealthy. We don't know. He was a paterfamilias, head of his household in Colossae. And he had this slave, Onesimus. His name literally is a slave name. It means useful or helpful. Except he wasn't so useful or helpful because he did something bad. We think he stole money, and then he ran off to Rome. He was a runaway slave. But then in Rome, he bumps into Paul, and he meets Paul. But more importantly, he meets Jesus. He becomes a follower of Jesus. And so Paul, now that he's working with Paul, Paul says, hey, I found this runaway slave named Useful, and he's become useful to my ministry. He's become really helpful to me. And now I'm going to write to Philemon, the master, who's been wronged by this runaway slave. And I'm going to tell him, I want you to receive him back, but I don't want you to receive him back as a slave. I want you to receive him as a brother. And anything he owes you, you put it on my account. Now, that was one of the early cyclical letters from the Apostle Paul that would be given to the house churches all over the region and then handed and read in church to church to church to church, including Ephesus. That was almost certainly read in the early church there. Can you imagine being the paterfamilias of that household, where the church is meeting in your household, that you have hundreds of slaves under you, and now you read this out loud, this letter from Paul. Awkward. Or Galatians, another famous letter from Paul. He says, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free. Nor is there male or female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Equality. We're all one. Unity. And if you're looking for something a little bit more explicit about how Paul really feels about the slave trade, he writes a letter to Timothy, who was in Ephesus at the time. This is after his letter to the Ephesians. So he writes Ephesians, and then he leaves Ephesus, and he leaves Timothy there, and he writes him this letter, and he compares those who are working in the slave trade at Ephesus, remember, a major center of the slave trade, and he compares slave traders, to get this, to people who murder their father and mother. So somehow, we need to hold these two things together. And these two things are really awkward to us. On the one hand, he is not actively trying to overthrow the political, social, whatever institution of slavery in Rome. He's not. You don't see that in the text. You do not see Paul trying to overthrow that. On the other hand, the Apostle Paul detests the slave trade, teaches that slaves are equal in Christ, and urges slaves to seek freedom and masters to let their slaves have freedom. Those two things, same time. In this passage, much of this cultural tension that's buried in it is actually lost in translation. So when we look at this, Paul addresses directly and first, slaves, obey your earthly masters. When he talks to slaves, this is not usual. This is not how you'd usually address slaves, because in that world, they were not viewed as a free moral agent. But the fact that Paul actually speaks to them directly, and before he even talks to masters, talks to the slaves, this is, and I quote Bill Arnold, the expert on ancient Ephesian culture, this is unprecedented in the ancient world. As in nowhere, no one anywhere in the ancient world is talking to a slave like this, no one, period. This is brand new. Who would speak to a slave like this? Who would actually act like they have the choice and they have the opinion and they have the moral authority to make these decisions for themselves? If you want to know like a baseline for how the ancient world viewed slaves, it would be Aristotle. He gives us the word that in English is chattel, an animate tool. He says in his Nicomachean Ethics, which is kind of like the ethical text that helped form so much of the Greco-Roman morality, this is what he says. Neither is there friendship towards a horse or an ox. You wouldn't be friends with a horse or an ox. That's ridiculous. Nor to a slave as a slave. For there is nothing common to the two parties. The slave is a living tool, and the tool a lifeless slave. He just compared human beings to a screwdriver. So, when in this world, this is the world you live in, when Paul suddenly starts treating slaves as free moral agents, image bearers, equals in Christ, inviting them to, exhorting them to, appealing to their this higher vision of morals, this higher motivations that you should serve wholeheartedly as if you are serving the Lord, not people. When he looks to them as image bearers and you can make a decision for yourself, this is a little more radical than we might first suspect. Something else is lost in translation here, and it is the definition of the word slavery. So here's a question. What do we mean by slavery? So tribal people from Papua New Guinea, they look at us and they say, you're all slaves. If you work at a full-time job and you don't own your time, you're a slave. The Apostle Paul will use the language of we are slaves to sin. Jesus will use the language we're slaves to sin. So what do you imagine when you hear the word slavery, and what would an ancient Roman Ephesian imagine when they hear the word slavery? And what's the overlap or the difference there? That's the question. So David, get this name. His name's David Davis. Cool name. He's a famous historian on the topic of slavery and human progress. His famous book, he spent 50 years studying the topic of slavery and its progression in the West, particularly in modern times. But he looks all the way across from ancient times to modern times. And in his book, Slavery and Human Progress, which is kind of like the benchmark work on this topic in the scholarship, he says this is really helpful. He points out that slavery is not so much like a specific definition of a word, but it's more a range. We should think of it as a range or a scale. So on the one end, you have Uncle Tom, what is the African New World slave trade, which was race-based. It was based on kidnapping. That slaves had almost no legal personhood or rights, so they were at 3/5 person, right? And it was for life. There was no end in sight. Just last night, I was working with my daughter, helping her on a research project for history, and we're reading through all these Abraham Lincoln speeches, and the thing that he notes again and again about this monstrous evil, his words, is the permanence of it. Is that all these laws that try and seek slavery to make it to set you apart as you can never escape it ever, that it sets apart, it defiles your humanity in that way. So on the one end, we have Uncle Tom, we have this New World slavery. On the other end, you have the 19-year-old mom in Philly, who herself, she had to escape an abusive, like drug abuse, broken past family. Along the way, she got, a couple kids from a couple different dads. One of the kids has a medical condition, and now she's caught in a situation, no education, no training, no help, no hope, that for the rest of her life, she's bound in this situation, and she's crushed by the guilt, by the weight, by the debt. She will never be able to provide for her kids, never be able to get out of debt, ever. Now, is that slavery? No, it's not technically slavery, but if you ask that young girl, hey, would you, if you could, go work for some millionaire and live in his household and just work for him for the rest of your life and know that your kids were taken care of, their education is taken care of, your medical care is taken care of, would you do that? She'd probably say yes. So that's the range of slavery. And then somewhere in the middle, you'd have medieval serfdom, where it's not technically slavery, but there's really no escaping that system. You've got to work for your lord forever, right? So the point being is that David Davis points out that Roman slavery is not over here and it's not over here, but it's somewhere in the middle. It's somewhere actually to my left, your right, of medieval serfdom. That it's in some ways it's better than medieval serfdom, and in some ways it might even be better than that single mom living in Philly. So here's the outline he gives of Roman slavery. Roman slavery was fueled by three things: war. Remember, the Romans, they were taking over everyone. And when they came in, part of their process was to enslave hundreds of thousands, millions of people in the process. 2, by debt. So if you had too much debt, you could sell yourself into slavery. That was waning by the time we get to the 1st century, but still a thing. And then 3rd is birth. So if you're a slave and you have a child, that child is born into slavery. But that being said, now when we try and define the shape of slavery, we now have these millions of slaves, the first thing we notice is that slavery is not race-based. It's not. So the Romans, they were an equal opportunity offender here. They would enslave everyone. They didn't care what you look like. We will enslave you. That's what they would do. 2, it was not especially cruel. Now I want to guard my words carefully here. It was cruel. But the master, the paterfamilias, he might beat you if you're a slave, but he might beat you if you're his wife. He might beat you if you're his child. He might beat you if you're his employee. If you're in his household, he can beat you, and he might. So there's no reason to believe that slavery was especially cruel at that time. The world was cruel. 3, slaves could accumulate wealth of their own. Many lived on separate properties, and get this, many slaves owned slaves. Huh. Slaves in the ancient Roman worked almost every imaginable job, and I quote, slaves were accountants, architects, artisans, doctors, librarians, philosophers, teachers, and writers. So about a month ago, I talked about Epictetus, this world-famous Stoic philosopher, this author, this genius, like world-changing philosopher. Yeah, he was a slave from Hierapolis. He was a slave. He got that education because he lived in a wealthy household, and they gave him that education, and he became a world-famous philosopher as a slave. And 5th, slaves could purchase their own freedom, and almost all of them did. So slaves could expect their freedom within 7 to 10 years. Under Roman law, persons in slavery could expect to be set free by the age of 30. Get this, if you were a slave of a Roman citizen, when you finally purchased your freedom, you became a Roman citizen. So Scott Barksdale, who's like arguably the leading scholar on New Testament studies of slavery, or at least he's the founding guy of this, he studied it for 50-some years, in his Harvard dissertation on 1st century slavery and the interpretation of 1 Corinthians 7:21, which I'm sure all of you own and will read tonight, he says, and it's worth quoting, in outward appearance, it was usually impossible to distinguish a slave from a freedman or a freeman. Neither his clothing, not his color, nor his race revealed his legal status. Neither his pattern of religious life, not his friends, not his work separated from the freedmen or free workers. By no means was the slave's position always a subordinate one, for in the household he served not only as a cook, cleaner, or personal attendant, but also as a tutor of persons of all ages, doctor, nurse, or close companion. In business, he was not only a delivery boy or janitor, he was also a secretary or manager of estates and shops and ships, contracting as an agent for his owner. Barksdale then goes on to argue that in some ways, being a slave in the ancient Roman world could be better, have its advantages over being a freedman, because slaves had job security. If you're a freedman and you were not part of a household, you were basically a day laborer, like those guys who have to stand on the road hoping someone hires them that day. And if someone doesn't hire them, they don't have an income. 2, many slaves had access to education that a freedman would never have. And 3, slaves, if you're a slave of a citizen, you actually had a pathway to citizenship, which a freedman otherwise would not have. Now, to be perfectly clear here, I am not trying to romanticize slavery as though it's some great thing. It was not. And I do want to have a realistic perspective here. So when Paul addresses slaves, he's not, on the one hand, addressing Uncle Tom. He is most likely writing to young men and young women in their teens and 20s who are a variety of ethnic backgrounds, who work a variety of professions, who are struggling to save up money so that they can someday purchase their freedom and expect to before the age of 30. Some even expect to become Roman citizens and business owners. So is the institution of slavery evil? Yes. Is the life of a Roman slave hard? No question. But is this different than how we usually imagine slavery? Well, it was, at least for me. I mean, I remember the first time I read this, I was like, what? That's totally different than anything I'd ever heard. So with that imagination, Paul's speaking to that crowd of people, that diverse crowd of young people in this when he addresses slaves. Let's reread this passage. He says, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. And get this motivation. Why should slaves obey with respect and fear? The Roman answer was quite clear. It's because you're inferior, and it's because you respect them because they might punish you, because they hold power over you. But Paul, he introduces a new motive here, that you should serve your earthly master because that's not your true master. You don't do it for them. You're doing it for Christ. In fact, he makes this explicit in verse 6 and following. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ. That's who you are. You're not a slave of this master. He's your earthly master. There's someone greater you're really serving in life. As slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. So here Paul actually coins a word. You see, don't only work when their eye is on you. The word literally is eye servers, eye workers. It's the idea of only doing your work when someone's watching you. So Paul is saying we don't want to be the type of people that the only reason you do what you're supposed to do is because someone else is watching you, that there's an internal motivation, because you know even if your master, earthly master, isn't watching you, Jesus is watching you. So there is no such thing as, get this, quiet quitting. Do you know that phrase? Not doing your job, just getting by. No, that's taken off the table. Why? Because you're not working for your earthly masters. You're not just working for a job. Ultimately, you are called into your position because you're working for Jesus Christ. Do you hear the dignity that he gives? He says slaves should view their work as a doctor would view his, or a teacher, or an architect, because in the ancient world, some slaves were those things. And there was dignity in what they did. So in Colossians 3:23, he famously says, whatever you do, are you a teacher? Are you a doctor? Are you a lawyer? Are you a janitor? Are you working at Wendy's? Are you a pastor? Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters. You know who he addresses that to? Slaves. So what motivates the Christian slave to do his job with faithfulness and excellence? Verse 7. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people. Because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. Now notice Paul, he's not saying that slavery is good, because it's not. But he is saying that your slavery doesn't decide your dignity. Your slavery does not decide your value. It doesn't decide how God views you. God does not view you as a slave. This is not so. This world, it can promise you freedom, but it can't give you the freedom you really want. Only God can give you that. In modern America, in our lives, we can hardly imagine a good life apart from complete and utter economic, social, political freedom. Like for us, the good life is almost always married to money, wealth, the ability to do whatever you want to do. This is enshrined famously in the Supreme Court decision in 1992, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Kennedy writes this, Justice Kennedy. At the heart of liberty, of freedom, American freedom, is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning of the universe, and the mystery of human life. That real liberty, American liberty, if you want American freedom, is to define reality itself. I decide for myself. I get what I want. Whatever I choose is what is good for me. I choose who I am. I choose what is good, what is bad, what is true, what is false. I choose everything. I decide everything. But the Apostle Paul, he's seeking a different kind of freedom. A freedom that can't be won with an army or bought with money. A freedom that politicians can't give you. A freedom that is not opposed. It's not opposed to social, political, economic freedom, but neither is it dependent on those things. It's not dependent on the money you have, the position you have, your place in society. There's a freedom that God gives that's not dependent on any of those things. By almost every imaginable standard, we are the freest people in the history of the world. You know that, right? I mean, by almost any imaginable measure, we have freedom upon freedom upon freedom. So here's my question. Why don't we feel free? Why do we feel so enslaved to fear, anxiety, hopelessness, to our stuff, to our work, to some unattainable standard, to our past, to our own desires? Why, when we see Jesus, who had none of that, right? He had none of that. He didn't get to go where he wanted to do or do what he wanted to do. Or he didn't have the money or the social clout to do all those things that we can do. He was a servant of all. Why, when we see Jesus, do we see in him a freedom that we can hardly name? We can hardly hope for. That feels unattainable to us, even though we have ultimate freedom. G.K. Chesterton has this little quip in one of his books where he talks about a man who sits there and rails, "I can do whatever I want. You can't tell me what to do. I can drink as much scotch as I want and smoke as many cigars as I want." And this is kind of like a tongue-in-cheek thing because he famously, G.K. Chesterton, the author, famously smoked cigars and drank scotch. So he says, if someone says, "I can do this as much as I want, you can't tell me what to do," if he does drink as much scotch as he wants and smokes as many cigars as he wants, Chesterton points out, soon the only choice he will have is what type of cigar to smoke and what type of scotch to drink, for he will have to drink scotch and smoke cigars. You see that there is a freedom that leads to slavery. And friends, we are the most free people in the world, and we are completely enslaved. What if true freedom was not doing whatever you want? It wasn't having your own desires. What if there's a freedom that means not having to obey your own desires, that you can do what's good even if that's not the first thing that comes to you? What if there's a freedom that's found in receiving what God says of you as opposed to creating your own meaning in the universe? What if Jesus was actually onto something when he said this? Whoever wants to become great among you, like if you want a great life, the good life, you got to become a servant. And whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. This, if we could believe it, if we could believe this, it would change everything. It would level the playing field. It would completely change how we view one another, and all these social structures and these power systems outside of us, they would cease to have any power with us. And that's exactly what happens in the text here. Paul then, he turns from slaves to masters and says, "Now masters, treat your slaves in the same way." Like, I don't have to say anything more because you're a slave just like they are, a slave of Christ. And that changes everything because you're equal on that playing field. Now, do not threaten them. You better not threaten them. That's off the table. That's not an option. Why? Because you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven. Therefore, there is no favoritism with him. Jesus does not recognize this world's social order. The slave who is serving you might be a slave in your household, but in the household of God, he's your brother. He's a child of God, and God does not take it lightly when you mistreat his children. Period. So do you see what Paul's up to in this? On the one hand, he does not call for a civil war. He doesn't incite Christians to overthrow the institution of slavery in the Roman world, but instead he just scatters these seeds. He plants seeds. He plants seeds of equality and grace. He plants a vision in the household of God. You're not just a part of this household, you're part of the household of God. He plants a vision for people who can now view each other, forgive each other's sins, and view each other as equals. He plants this vision of love that removes the threat of even the possibility of threatening one another. You wouldn't do that. You wouldn't do that if you loved each other this way. He plants this love so deeply in them that it then motivates them to live their lives, even as slaves, for the glory of God, in a way that no master could have any power over them. Remember, Paul himself is an expert in this. So many of the words we read of his are written from prison when he had no power. Jesus was a servant of all. So the Apostle Paul, he plants these seeds and then he sits back and he watches them grow silently underneath the surface. And like a tree, there's tree roots that grow underneath the sidewalks. This grows into a mighty tree, and eventually it breaks up the Roman way of life, and it breaks up and ultimately destroys the institution of slavery itself. So Rodney Stark, who I quoted last week before, he's a historian, sociologist, an expert on the early church, the sociology of the early church. In his book, The Glory of God, he explains, "This is not to deny that the early Christians condoned slavery. It is to recognize that of all the world's religions, including the three great monotheisms, only in Christianity did the idea develop that slavery was sinful and must be abolished. Although it has been fashionable to deny it, anti-slavery doctrine began to appear in Christian theology soon after the decline of Rome and was accompanied by the eventual disappearance of slavery. When Europeans subsequently instituted slavery in the New World, they did so over the strenuous papal opposition, a fact that was conveniently lost from history until recently. Finally, the abolition of New World slavery was initiated and achieved by Christian activists." So on the one hand, we can and should seek justice in our world. For those who don't believe this, we should seek political, economic, social freedom for ourselves and for others. And I thank God that we live in a world that we have the freedoms we do. I really do. But if that's all we seek, well, you can be free and a slave at the same time. So in the Bible, at least from the time of Exodus on, slavery becomes a root metaphor for the human condition apart from God. So the ancient Israelites, when God finds them, what are they? They're enslaved, literally enslaved to Pharaoh. And so he purchases them, he redeems them out of slavery and calls them to himself and adopts them as his very children. They are no longer slaves, but they become children of God. And then this language shapes our biblical imagination, our view of what it means to be a child of God. That all comes from that and arcs all the way through the New Testament till we get to Jesus, who says everyone who sins is a slave to sin. That if you want to know the root cause of slavery, it's ultimately your relationship with God. It's when you let those desires come out and you separate yourself from God. That's the root cause of why we dehumanize ourselves and one another. And then in Romans chapter 6, the Apostle Paul explains this more. He says, Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, when you offer yourselves, you are slaves to the one you obey. Whether you're slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness, that apart from a work of God in our lives, we are all slaves. We're slaves to our own desires. We're slaves to the gods of work and achievement. We're slaves to the gods of money and security and approval, slaves to a culture that will use you and will only give you value so long as you play by its rules and you do what it says. The moment you step out of line, it will reject you, it will shame you, and it will get rid of you. Apart from a work of God in our lives, we're all slaves, but God the Son, Jesus, took on flesh, entered into our world, and became a slave, a servant of all. And he showed us a way to freedom that has nothing to do with social, economic, political freedom. He showed us the true way to conquer. It's not by getting everything you want and protecting all your own desires. It's by giving them up. It's by dying to yourself that we pick up our cross and we follow him. That's the way to true life. And then he went to the cross, and on the cross, he paid our redemption price. Peter spells it out exactly. He says, it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life. You were slaves, but you've been redeemed. It wasn't with perishable things, but it was with the precious blood of Christ that you've been redeemed. That he died so that you could be set free, and now by his blood we are free, so that the Apostle Paul says, but thanks be to God that though you used to be slaves to sin, you've now come to obey from the heart the pattern of teaching that has now claimed your allegiance. You have been set free from sin. You're free. You don't have to live according to those desires anymore. That if we would just receive the gift of what Christ has done for us, he's paid the price. The redemption price. You're no longer a slave. You are a child of God. And so that God then pours into you his Holy Spirit, and that Spirit that is within you cries out, Abba, Father, I'm a child of God. The problem with slavery in our world is that most of us don't see it. In the name of freedom, we're binding the chains. But if you trust Christ, if you believe in him, there is freedom. If you want to know just a test of am I enslaved right now and don't even know it, just ask yourself this. When God the Father looks at you, can you experience him turning his face towards you, looking at you, and saying, you are my child, whom I love and whom I am well pleased? If you can't, something's wrong. That is the gospel. Jesus died to give that to you. That is yours. The Spirit is in you, crying out, looking for that, seeking you, pointing your heart towards that. This decisive act whereby we say, this is true of me, I am no longer a slave, but I am a beloved child of God. We signify this, we celebrate this in an act we call baptism. And that's how we're going to finish our service today. In baptism, individuals stand before God and witnesses and make a public profession of their faith to commit their lives to the Lord, but more importantly, to receive what they could not earn, what they could not do, to say that what Jesus did is for me. So they make their public profession before us and before God, but God makes his public profession before us as well, over them. That in baptism, the Lord says over Rebecca and Savannah and Brooke and Taryn, you are mine. You are my child whom I love and whom I am well pleased. You've been set free. You're no longer a slave. So that's how we're going to finish the service today.